Late summer on the Ash Creek Flats, Montana Territory. The evening light cast long shadows across the Montana Territory as Asa Merrick crested the ridge overlooking the dry creek bed. He had been tracking a wayward calf for the better part of the afternoon, following hoofprints and broken brush through the scrub oak and sage. At 31, Asa carried himself with the measured movements of a man who had seen too much violence and chosen solitude as his refuge. The war had left its marks on him, a scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, a slight hitch in his stride from shrapnel that still worked its way to the surface on cold mornings, and eyes that held the particular weariness of someone who had witnessed humanity at its worst. His small ranch sat in a valley where Ash Creek meandered through cottonwoods and willows, a place so remote that weeks could pass without seeing another soul. That isolation suited him fine. He had built the cabin with his own hands, raised the barn timber by timber, and carved out a life that asked nothing of the world except to be left alone. The cattle were good company. They demanded only grass, water, and protection from wolves. They never asked questions about the nightmares that still woke him, or why he sometimes stood at his window in the small hours, watching the darkness as if it might swallow him whole. The metallic clinking reached his ears before he saw its source. It was a sound he recognized from his soldiering days, the rhythmic rattle of chains against metal, the kind used for prisoners or cargo. But this was neither a military convoy nor a freight wagon. As he guided his horse toward the sound, keeping to the shadow of the ridge, the scene that unfolded below made his stomach turn. A ramshackle wagon lurched along the rough trail, pulled by two mules that looked as weary as everything else in this god-forsaken stretch of country. The wagon itself was little more than a collection of weathered boards held together by rust-stained nails and sheer stubbornness. On the driver's seat sat two men Asa didn't recognize, rough-looking characters in dirty clothes, passing a bottle between them and laughing at some private joke that seemed to involve glancing back at their cargo. It was the cargo that made Asa's blood run cold. Chained to the rear axle of the wagon was a young woman, her wrists bound with heavy iron shackles that had worn bloody grooves in her skin. She stumbled behind the wagon, trying to keep pace with its jerky progress, her bare feet leaving small clouds of dust with each desperate step. Her dress, what remained of it, was torn and filthy, hanging in tatters that barely preserved her modesty. Her long black hair was matted with dirt and sweat, falling across her face like a veil of suffering, even from a distance. Asa could see the way her shoulders shook with exhaustion, how her legs trembled with each step. The men on the wagon seemed oblivious to her struggles. Or perhaps they simply didn't care. They were discussing something in loud, drunken voices that carried across the evening air. Their words slurred, but their intent clear enough. They were treating her like property, like livestock to be transported and sold. Asa had spent years trying to forget the things he had seen during the war. The casual cruelty that men could visit upon each other when they convinced themselves that their victims were somehow less than human. He had told himself that he was done with violence, done with being the man who stepped into situations like this one. His ranch was supposed to be his sanctuary from all of that, a place where the worst thing he had to deal with was a sick calf or a broken fence post. But as he watched the woman stumble and nearly fall, only to be jerked upright by the chain that bound her, something inside him snapped. The part of himself that he had tried to bury, the soldier, the protector, the man who had once stood between the innocent and those who would harm them, came roaring back to life. He dismounted and ground-tied his horse, then began making his way down the slope on foot, moving with the silent precision that had kept him alive through 4 years of war. The two men were too drunk and too focused on their conversation to notice his approach. As he drew closer, he could make out their words. "Reckon we'll get a good price for her in Billings," one of them was saying. He was a heavy-set man with a graying beard and the kind of gut that spoke of too much whiskey and not enough honest work. His companion was younger and thinner, with shifty eyes and the nervous energy of someone who was always looking over his shoulder. "Hell, Jed," We shoulda sold her back in Bozeman. The thin one replied, "This drag is wearing her down something fierce. She ain't gonna be worth much if she's half dead when we get there. She's tough enough." Vern. These Apache women, they're bred for hard work. Besides, a few marks ain't gonna hurt the price. None. Some folks like 'em a little roughed up. Their laughter made Asa's jaw clench so hard he thought his teeth might crack. He had heard talk like this before. During the war, the way soldiers sometimes spoke about enemy civilians, reducing human beings to objects to be used and discarded. It was the kind of talk that had made him sick then, and it made him sick now. The woman behind the wagon lifted her head, as if sensing his presence, and for a moment their eyes met across the dusty distance. Even through the dirt and exhaustion, he could see the intelligence there. The fierce will that had kept her going, despite everything they had done to her. She didn't cry out or try to signal him. Perhaps she had learned better than to hope for rescue. But something in her gaze, a mixture of defiance and desperation, told him everything he needed to know. Asa stepped out of the shadows and into the path of the wagon, his hand resting casually on the grip of his Colt revolver. The mules, startled by his sudden appearance, shied and came to a halt, their ears laid back in nervous protest. "Evening, gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that had once commanded a company of Union soldiers. "Might I have a word, Jed?" The older of the two men squinted down at him with the suspicious glare of someone who was used to trouble finding him in unexpected places. His hand moved toward the rifle that lay across his knees. But he didn't pick it up. Not yet. "You got business with us?" Mr. Jed asked. His words slightly slurred, but his tone aggressive. "Because if you don't, I'd suggest you move along. We got places to be." Asa glanced back at the woman chained to the wagon, noting the way she had sunk to her knees in the dust, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. The shackles around her wrists were slick with blood, and he could see bruises on her arms and shoulders that spoke of rough handling. "That depends," Asa replied, his voice still calm, but with an edge that anyone who knew him would have recognized as dangerous. "I'm wondering about your cargo there. Seems like unusual freight for this part of the territory." Vern, the younger man, let out a nervous laugh and took another pull from the bottle. "Ain't no concern of yours, friend. We got papers for her. Legal and proper." "Papers," Asa repeated, as if testing the word. "What kind of papers would those be?" "The kind that says she's ours to do with as we please," Jed said, his hand now openly gripping the rifle. "Now you best move along before this conversation gets unfriendly." The woman raised her head at the sound of voices, and Asa saw her eyes widen slightly as she took in the scene. She was younger than he had initially thought, probably no more than 25, with the kind of classical features that would have been called beautiful under different circumstances. Her skin was bronzed by sun and weather, and despite the dirt and exhaustion, there was something regal about the way she held herself, as if chains and abuse could not touch the essential dignity that lived inside her. "Those papers," Asa said, never taking his eyes off Jed. "They wouldn't happen to be slave papers, would they? Because I was under the impression that particular institution had been abolished some years back." The silence that followed was heavy with tension. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out as it circled overhead, and the mules stamped impatiently, sensing the conflict brewing among the humans. "You calling us slavers?" Vern demanded, his voice climbing an octave with indignation. "Because that's a hell of an accusation to make." "Mister, I'm not calling you anything," Asa replied. "I'm asking a simple question about the woman chained to your wagon. Because, where I come from, free people don't get dragged behind carts like livestock." Jed's face had gone red with anger and alcohol. "She ain't free. You interfering bastard. She's a prisoner. Captured fair and square after her. People raided a settlement down south. We got every right to transport her to the authorities." It was a lie. and they all knew it. The woman's clothes, what remained of them, were not the traditional dress of a warrior or raider. She wore the simple cotton dress of someone who had been living peacefully, probably working as a seamstress or domestic in one of the frontier towns. Her hands, though calloused from work, were not the hands of someone who had spent her life on the warpath. "Funny thing about that," Asa said, stepping closer to the wagon, "because she looks to me like someone who was going about her business when you decided to make her your business. And even if she was a prisoner, which I doubt, that wouldn't give you the right to treat her like an animal." The woman had been listening to this exchange with growing hope, but now she spoke for the first time since Asa had arrived. Her voice was hoarse from thirst and exhaustion, but it carried clearly in the still evening air. "Please," she said, the single word containing worlds of suffering and desperation. "My name is Nullen. I was working in the town of Cedar Falls when these men took me from the boarding house where I lived. I have done nothing wrong." Her English was accented but clear, with the precise diction of someone who had learned the language carefully and spoke it with pride. Asa felt something twist in his chest as he heard the dignity in her voice, the way she managed to sound like a human being, asking for help rather than a victim begging for mercy. "You hear that?" Asa asked, his voice hardening. "The lady says you kidnapped her. Now, I don't know much about the law, but I'm pretty sure that's a hanging offense in most territories." Jed's grip on his rifle tightened, and Asa could see the calculation in his eyes, the drunken math of a man trying to decide if killing a witness was worth the risk. Vern was reaching for a pistol tucked into his belt, his movements clumsy with drink, but still dangerous. "You got a choice here. Gentlemen," Asa continued, his own hand now openly resting on his gun. "You can unlock those chains and ride away. Or we can settle this in a way that's likely to leave some of us permanently horizontal. Your call." The standoff stretched out like a taut wire, each man waiting for someone else to make the first move. The woman Nalin watched with wide eyes, probably wondering if this stranger was her salvation or just another predator drawn to the scent of violence. It was Vern who broke first. Whether from nerves or stupidity, he yanked his pistol from his belt and tried to bring it to bear on Asa. But Asa had been expecting something like this, and he moved with the fluid precision of a man who had survived too many battles to be caught off guard by a drunk with a gun. His Colt cleared leather in a smooth draw that would have impressed the fastest gunfighters in Dodge City or Tombstone. The shot echoed across the flats like thunder, and Vern's pistol went spinning away into the dust, along with two of his fingers and a good deal of his dignity. Before Jed could bring his rifle around, Asa had moved to put the wagon between himself and the older man, using the mules and the wooden sides as cover. But instead of continuing the fight, he did something that surprised everyone present, including himself. He holstered his gun and walked calmly to the rear of the wagon, where Nayland knelt in the dust with her chained hands pressed against her chest. Without a word, he drew a small folding knife from his pocket and began working at the lock that held her shackles closed. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Jed shouted, but his voice had lost its aggressive edge and taken on the querulous tone of a man who suddenly found himself outmatched. "I'm freeing this woman," Asa replied matter-of-factly, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The lock was old and poorly made, and it took only a few seconds of careful manipulation to spring it open. The chains fell away from Nalan's wrists with a clatter that seemed to echo across the entire territory. She looked up at him with eyes that held a mixture of gratitude and disbelief, rubbing at the raw wounds where the iron had bitten into her skin. When she tried to stand, her legs buckled, and Asa caught her arm to steady her. "Easy there," he said gently. "You've been through enough for one day." Vern was still howling and clutching his mangled hand, while Jed sat on the wagon seat looking like a man who had just watched his life's work crumble into dust. The older man's rifle lay forgotten across his knees as he stared at his wounded partner and the freed prisoner. "This ain't over," Jed said finally, his voice thick with impotent rage. "You got no idea who you're messing with." "Mister, there's people gonna want to know what happened here." Asa looked up at him with the kind of cold stare that had once made Confederate prisoners think twice about causing trouble. "Then you tell them," he said quietly. "You tell them that someone finally said no. You tell them that not everybody in this territory is willing to look the other way, while men like you trade in human misery. And you tell them that if they want to do something about it, they know where to find me." He helped Nalan to her feet and guided her toward his horse, which had remained ground-tied throughout the confrontation, trained by years of use to stay put even during gunfire. "What's your name?" Mr. Jed called out as Asa prepared to mount up. "So I know what to put on your headstone when we come back." Asa paused with one foot in the stirrup and looked back at the two men on the wagon. "Name's Asa Merrick," he said. "I've got a spread about 5 miles north of here, along Ash Creek. You're welcome to come calling any time you feel lucky." He swung into the saddle and reached down to help Nalan up behind him. She was lighter than he had expected, her body worn thin by whatever ordeal she had endured before he found her. As she settled behind him on the horse, he could feel her trembling, whether from cold, exhaustion, or delayed shock. He couldn't tell. "Hold on," he told her quietly, and she wrapped her arms around his waist with a grip that spoke of desperate gratitude. As they rode away from the wagon, Asa could hear Jed cursing and trying to get Vern to stop his moaning long enough to help drive. The two men would probably head for the nearest town to get Vern's hand looked at, and they would undoubtedly spin some tale about being attacked by claim jumpers or road agents. But Asa doubted they would come looking for him anytime soon. Men like that were bullies at heart, and bullies preferred easy targets to fair fights. The ride back to his ranch passed in silence, with Nalan holding tight to his waist and the evening stars beginning to appear overhead. Asa found himself wondering what he had gotten himself into, what obligations he had taken on by interfering in something that was, strictly speaking, none of his business. He had built his life around avoiding exactly this kind of complication, the kind of situation that drew a man into other people's troubles and forced him to make choices that could haunt him for years. But when he felt Nalan shiver behind him and pulled his coat back to share its warmth, he found that he didn't regret his decision. There were some things that a man couldn't walk away from, no matter how much he wanted to avoid trouble. And sometimes, doing the right thing was worth whatever consequences might follow. His cabin sat in a small clearing beside Ash Creek, a simple but sturdy structure of logs and stone that he had built to last through Montana winters. The barn stood nearby, along with a corral that currently held his small herd of cattle and a few horses. It was a modest operation, but it was his, bought with his own money and built with his own hands. As they approached the cabin, Nalan lifted her head and looked around with interest, taking in the neat garden plot, the well-maintained fence lines, and the general air of careful order that marked the home of a man who took pride in his work. "It's beautiful," she said softly, the first words she had spoken since giving her name back at the wagon. Asa helped her down from the horse and led her toward the cabin door, noting the way she favored her right foot and the careful way she moved, as if every step caused her pain. "It's not much," he replied, "but it's quiet. And right now, quiet seems like it might be just what you need." Inside, the cabin was spartanly furnished, but clean and comfortable. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a few chairs arranged around it and shelves holding his small collection of books. The kitchen area was simple but functional, with a cast-iron stove and a table where he took his meals. A ladder led up to a small loft where he kept his bed and personal belongings. Asa lit a lamp and gestured toward one of the chairs by the fireplace. "Sit," he said. "I'll get a fire going and rustle up something to eat." Nalan sank into the chair with a grateful sigh, and Asa could see her properly for the first time in good light. The bruises were worse than he had thought, and the wounds on her wrists would need cleaning and bandaging. Her feet were cut and swollen from walking barefoot over rough ground, and her clothes were little more than rags. But despite everything she had endured, There was something unbroken about her. A core of strength that showed in the way she held her shoulders and the alert intelligence in her dark eyes. She was a survivor, he realized. The kind of person who could endure terrible things and still come out on the other side with her essential self intact. "Are you hungry?" he asked, busying himself with building up the fire. "I've got some stew left from yesterday, and there's bread and honey." "Yes," she replied simply. "Thank you." As the fire caught and began to warm the cabin, Asa moved around his small kitchen, heating up the leftover stew and slicing bread with the economical movements of a man who was used to caring for himself. He found himself stealing glances at Nalin, wondering about her story, about what had led her to that wagon and those chains. When he set the food in front of her, she ate slowly and carefully, like someone who hadn't had a proper meal in quite some time. He let her eat in peace, occupying himself with cleaning his rifle and checking the loads in his pistol. If Jed and Vern decided to come looking for revenge, he wanted to be ready. "Why did you help me?" Nalin asked suddenly, looking up from her bowl. Asa paused in his work and considered the question. It was fair enough. She had no reason to trust him, and every reason to be suspicious of a strange man who had taken her to his isolated cabin. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said finally. "Because I've seen what happens when good people stand by and do nothing while bad things happen to innocent folks. And because—" He trailed off. "I'm not sure how to put the rest into words." "Because," she prompted gently. "Because I've been running from fights for too long," he admitted. "I spent 4 years in the war. And when it was over, I told myself I was done with violence, done with being the man who stepped between the hammer and the anvil. But some fights you can't run from. Some things are worth standing up for, no matter what it costs you." Nalin nodded as if she understood something about running from fights, about the cost of both action and inaction. "My people have a saying," she said quietly. "The person who saves a life becomes responsible for that life. I am your responsibility now." Asa Merrick. The way she said his name, with careful pronunciation and a slight smile, made something warm uncurl in his chest. It had been a long time since anyone had spoken his name like that. As if it mattered. As if he mattered. "I don't think of it that way," he replied. "I think of it as one person helping another when help was needed. What you do from here is up to you." She finished her meal in thoughtful silence, and Asa found himself wondering what she would choose to do. He could take her to town in the morning, to help her find passage to wherever she wanted to go. He could give her some money and provisions and send her on her way with his best wishes. It would be the practical thing to do, the thing that would keep his life simple and uncomplicated. But as he watched her by the firelight, seeing the way the flames picked out the bronze in her skin and the strength in her profile, he found himself hoping that she might choose to stay, at least for a while. The cabin had been too quiet for too long, and he was surprised to discover how much he had missed the simple pleasure of sharing a meal with another human being. "I need to tend to those wounds," he said finally, rising to fetch his medical supplies from a shelf near the kitchen. "Those chains did some damage." She held out her hands without protest, and he cleaned the raw wounds on her wrists with gentle efficiency, wrapping them in clean bandages and checking to make sure there were no signs of infection. Her feet were in worse shape, cut and bruised from walking over rocky ground, and he spent several minutes carefully removing bits of gravel and debris from the wounds. "You've done this before," she observed, watching him work. "Field medicine," he explained. "You learn to patch people up when there's no doctor around and the nearest hospital is 100 miles away." When he was finished, he helped her up to the loft where his bed was located, giving her one of his clean shirts to use as a nightgown, and settling himself downstairs by the fire with a blanket and pillow. It wasn't the most comfortable arrangement, but it was temporary, and he had slept in worse places. As he lay, listening to the sounds of the night, the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods, the distant call of an owl, the soft breathing of the woman upstairs, Asa found himself thinking about the future in a way he hadn't for years. His life had been carefully constructed around avoiding entanglements, around keeping his world small and manageable. But now, that world had suddenly expanded to include another person. Someone whose presence changed everything simply by existing. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or whether Nalin would choose to stay or go. He didn't know if Jed and Vern would be foolish enough to come looking for trouble, or what other complications might arise from his decision to interfere in their affairs. What he did know was that for the first time in years, he felt like he was living instead of just existing, like he was part of something larger than his own solitary struggles. And as he drifted off to sleep by the dying fire, Asa Merrick allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, the worst of his running days were behind him.